بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم لك الحمد على العافية، ولك الحمد على كل نعمة أنعمت بها علينا في قديم أو حديث، في السراء والعلانية. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على خاتم الأنبياء الذي بعثه الله رحمة للعالمين، سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of here and the hereafter. O Lord, we thank you for the health that we have, and we thank you for all the blessing that we receive from you all the time, in the past, in the future. We convey our greeting and salutation to the Holy Prophet of Islam, that Allah has sent him as a blessing for the world and his pure progenies. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the third night of our 2020 Muharram program, with a slight adjustment. And we start with a brief part of the Nahj al-Balagha khutbah number 16. Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi in khutbah points out, ألا وإن بليتكم قد عادت كهيئتها يوم بعث الله نبيكم والذي بعثه بالحق لتبلبلن بلبلة. You should know that your troubles and the challenges that the Holy Prophet of Islam faced at the onset, the beginning of Islam, has come to dominate. Again, I swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you will be shaken and your social structure will be turned upside down. Before we delve into the significant meaning of this khutbah, which inshallah soon I will talk about it, I want to go back, the brief recap of what we have already discussed. In the first two nights, we addressed and examined four possible motives that were given in our literature for the uprising of Imam Hussein salawatullah. First one was ta'abbud, that Imam Hussein was commanded, and he had no option, because he is ma'soom and he would follow that command. Number two, it was somehow a revolution. And number three, it was self-defense. And number four, it was reform and islah. As we discussed every single one of them, I pointed out that if we were to search for each one by itself to become the main motivator for the event to take place, these would deny us that possibility of being able to use it, particularly the self-defense and ta'abbud, were problematic. As ta'abbud rested on at least three assumptions, but one of them was that each imam would receive at the beginning of his imamah some kind of a mushaf or book, that Allah literally charters his path through the life, and he has no other way but to navigate according to the command that exists within this chart. We have no documents whatsoever to prove that. No, I've never heard or I've come across any hadith from any imam that says we are to follow this particular path. As a matter of fact, all the scholars, and I pointed out to a book written by Marhum Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr that examines the role of the imams. Are they each independently have a strategy for themselves, or and different goals because they all follow different goals, or the goal is singular but the strategies are different because of the force of circumstance? None of them would have indicated that we follow this path because when my father passed away, I was given a book and this, my path literally, or my responsibility has been charted. Self-defense becomes problematic because then the issue was, the question that I had was, let us assume if Imam Hussein really had no other option but to defend himself. Why? Because Yazid left no other option for him, either capitulate or be killed, and between these two options, then Imam Hussein had no other choice but to accept going through the whole procedure and be killed because he did not want to submit. Counter argument that I presented, let us assume that Yazid came to power, bearing in mind that Imam Hussein and Ahlul Bayt up to that time, they knew how toxic the character was, as Yazid character was. If Yazid had come to power and never sent a document to his governor in Medina that you have to force Hussein ibn Ali, Abdullah ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and few others to succumb and sign allegiance, if he had not done that, does that mean because it's self-defense that Imam Hussein would have kept quiet and said nothing about this? It's become problematic. The issue of Islah, again, to a degree was, the scope was limited. And at the end, I thought that probably events of this magnitude, searching for a singular event is not judicious because complex events require complex and fluid strategies. We have no problem with the idea that the immediate response was self-defense, to remove himself from Medina so he will not be assassinated. But this strategy is not fixed. As the situation develops and the letters arrive and people of Kufa promise, etc., the strategy changes accordingly. And ultimately, while the overall schema of things that he operated under was Islah, there's no problem with that. So that notion had to be, I think it's a better approach in assessment and analysis and examining the whole Ashura uprising. I also indicated that there are two questions when we get to an event of this magnitude. As in the Christian literature, they call it singular event, and they point to the crucifixion of Jesus according to their own theology as a singular event, which means you can look before and after to it. They become defining moment that the history before and history after has to be compared or contrasted. So when we have such an event, two questions are critical. Number one, why this event happened 50 years after the demise of the Holy Prophet. Muslims, at least certain, some of them we can say supporters of Bani Umayyah, Uthmani, and so on, but within the people of Kufa, or at least the army of Umar ibn Sa'd, there were a number of Shias. That Shia, in a sense, this inshallah one day we have to address. Shia as a school evolved beginning of 2nd century. But Shia as a followers, muhibbin, and the lovers of Ahlul Bayt certainly existed. Because we have a number of ahadith from Imam Hussein on the day of Ashura, as well as when he stood up, he counted one by one. He said, Ya Fulan, Ya Fulan, Ya Fulan, didn't you sign a letter that come and we will help you? So from his camp, or the supporters, or those who have at least some allegiance to his way of thinking were there. The question is, under the pretense, under the banner of Islam, on the day of Ashura, 2 Jama'ah prayers are organized. One led by Imam Hussein, the other one led by Umar ibn Sa'd. Opposing camp. How did that happen? How did Islam was deformed and literally turned into some superficial, shallow shell that empty of its own spiritual context? That's number one. And number two, the underpinning of this event. What led to it? Because when we ask the question of underpinning, it presupposes that events of this magnitude are not going to happen in vacuum. And quantum leap is not possible. If gradual change of history that leads, whether it is environmental context, whether it's social context, whether it's political context, whether it's religious context, with a combination of all, these events have to be understood so that we have a better picture of what happened before and why that event took place. Now, when we get to assessment and examining of history, trying to find out a particular moment in any history, and this is critical for scholars and historians, to find out a particular moment that the fault line is clearly established, where before and after a shift of magnitude has taken place. It's very difficult. Luckily, in our case, there is one event that we can identify as a fault line, as something that literally before and after can be distinguished and delineated as critical, and that was Saqifa. We get to it inshallah later, but I want to explain. Imagine in our contemporary political structure, the president comes in, the new administrations, which here in the United States, led by the president, comes in other so-called Western democracies, they have differently. And the embodiment of this administration stands before the camera and faces the population and gives you a frank account of the situation as he or she has found it. The treasury is empty, the wealth is gone, the gold evaporated. Wouldn't we take it seriously and we say, look, what has happened? Certainly we do. It becomes a significant event that we begin to asking ourselves, what happened in the previous administration that literally the country is bankrupt? Now, in material thing, switch it to what we call ethical and moral concept. Khutbah number 16 is given, or Amir al-Mu'mineen delivered it at the moment that people swore bay'ah to him as the Imam or the Khalifa, the fourth Caliph. So literally, he is the voice of the new administration, and he gives you a frank account of the moral status of the society at the time. And he says, corrupt. I need to shake this social structure and turn it upside down. Otherwise, all the values and principles that the Holy Prophet ﷺ came and Islam came for it, evaporated, disappeared. The social structure has been left with shallow understanding. Yes, they pray. Yes, they fast. Yes, by thousand they go to Hajj. But then they accept Yazid or Muawiyah to be their leader. This is the dichotomy that Shahid Sadr points to it. If you accept that on the one hand you claim allegiance to a faith, and at the same time you accept the contradiction on the moral and principle values, then there is some fundamental problem in understanding the faith. Amir al-Mu'mineen says, "Ala wa inna baliyatukum qad aadat." everything that this new faith came to change, for the radical establishment of a society, for a radical transformation in consciousness, has gone. And that's year what? 35 after Hijrah. The Holy Prophet died 10 after Hijrah, beginning of 11th. So within 25 years, the entire moral principle of Islam disappeared. He's not worried about prayer. He's not worried about fasting. He's not worried about Hajj or even Zakat and Khums. He's worried about justice. He's worried about haqq. These are the ones that are absent within the society at that time. You become indifferent. I go to the mosque, I offer my prayer, I do my fasting, I go to Hajj whenever I can, and that's it, that's Islam. I care less about anybody else. But when you look at the history of Islam, Islam came to establish a pragmatic society that not only just in its structure, seeks justice and supports justice. And the society was not there. This is why he said, for me to go back and establish that social structure, I have no other option but for a radical change. Turn the society, the social structure upside down. This is the report that he gives. Naturally, now if this, we really have to take it seriously. Within 25 years, what was the cause, the original reason, or at least that fault line that we are looking for that led to this transformation? And by the way, one of the things that we can sit down and reflect and contemplate is compare the status of our society with the time that the Imam took control of it. See where we are within this continuum. They prayed, we pray. They fasted, we fast. They went to Hajj, we go to Hajj, inshallah. They paid their zakat and khums, okay, we don't pay it. They did everything else, at least on surface, that's done. And yet, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, I'm not worried about these issues. I'm worried about justice, haqq, batil, amr bil-ma'roof, nahy an al-munkar, etc., etc. Where are we with regard to these fundamental principles? Far from it. It's quite obvious that we really need to understand that Jahiliyyah wasn't just for before Islam. Jahiliyyah talks about a unique structure, that it has its own ontological and epistemological feeling. It has a unique worldview and a way of understanding its path going through it. So where are we now? When we become indifferent, Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi dismisses his wali, his representative in Basra, for going to a rich man's house during the month of Ramadan and eating iftar. He didn't violate any particular theological or religious law. He was invited, he went. He tells him, he reminds him of something different. He reminds him of his social responsibility and ethical and moral behavior. He says, how could you go to a rich man's house that they lays all the long table, while in the same area there are those who do not remember the last time that they had full stomach? You don't deserve to represent Ali. This is the fundamental principle. This is how we should judge our society. Where are we now with regard to the moral, ethical behavior? Can we pass by and say, I see no evil, when so many people are suffering around us? I'm okay, Jack syndrome. As long as I have 6 cars, bigger house, etc., etc., why should I care about anybody else? God, I earned it, the Qarun mentality. I have no responsibility towards the other people. Amir al-Mu'mineen focuses on these. He says, I am the leader and I have only a single raghif, a piece of bread in a day. Why? Because if it happened on the day of judgment that the poor person came to me and said, Ya Amir al-Mu'min or Ya Ali, during your reign, my right was not given, not consciously or willingly, but I slipped. At least I can say my lifestyle, the standard of life was not better than his, was equal or below. He swears to Ahl al-Kufa. He says, when I came to Kufa, I had 2 shirts, and I still possess those 2 shirts. I have taken nothing from your Baytul Mal. This is compared to Uthman, compared to the second Khalif Umar and the first Khalif. This is the fundamental problem that we really need to focus upon. So if we are searching, Imam Hussein, again, in his continuous journey, this is why I say, Hayhat min al-dhilla is in Medina. ألا ترون إن الحق لا يعمل به وأن الباطل لا ينهى عنه, is as he moves towards Kufa. The strategy changes. So Saqifa becomes the critical factor. It may be difficult. We really need to examine it fully to see exactly what happened. Those of you who remember the story of Ghadir, we talked about this little bit. I said at that time that the classical strategy of talking about Ghadir has not produced anything. Why? Because we rely on ahadith and say this hadith, that hadith, and the other person says, I don't believe in this, this doesn't happen. 1,400 years we have talked about this. Allah yarham marhum Mahdi Shamsuddin, Sheikh Mahdi Shamsuddin in Lebanon. He presented this as an idea. He said, we really are not getting anywhere. We need to approach differently. Look at it from more of a sociological or anthropological point of view. Remember, a baggage, old baggage, carried by people, generation after generation, is not going to be dealt with and negated by giving them, shoving few hadith into their nostrils. You just go look at number of TV shows that we have. Constantly they think they have gone to Marikh or something. Well, we went through Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and so on, and there is this hadith. Zoom on it to show the people that the hadith exists, this book or the other book. It is an ideological issue. Marhum Allama Amini wrote a book, spent the entire life of his. During my childhood, I used to go to his library. I used to see him. Spend the whole life traveling around Middle East and other part of the world, collecting ahadith regarding Al-Ghadir from the Sunni sources. From going back to Tabi'een, the generation after the Holy Prophet. 11 volumes. He spends close to 100 pages dealing with the word Mawla, etymology of the word Mawla. What's the root? Where did it come from? Various contexts, its meaning, etc., etc. How many people looked at it and said, oh yes, this is convincing argument and we're going to change? Very few. Marhum Sharafuddin in Lebanon spent months, if not years, debating with the Imam of Al-Azhar, Sheikh Salim. The result of that conversation turned into a book called Al-Muraja'at. Did Sheikh Salim change his view? No. He simply was one of the pioneers regarding the fatwa, although Mahmoud Shaltut gave it later, but it was him who started it. That yes, Madhab al-Ja'fari is another madhab that we can rely on. Even within academia today, we have a number of people have written their PhD dissertation on it, and a number of other things. Even scholars, Western scholars, about the succession of to the Holy Prophet. Nobody's going to listen. It's an old baggage. They carry it, and they're not worried about hadith here and hadith there. This is why Sheikh Shamsuddin was of the opinion that we really need to shift our methodology. I'm not claiming that shifting the methodology is going to convince everybody, but at least less of the article yes, no, yes, no. And the rationale is this. If you have a radical a view or a religion, call it some kind of philosophical idea or religious idea, that desires to radically change the society in all of its structure, ethical, moral, political, etc., etc. How many generations do you need, or do we need, for the values to become engraved and habitual in the life of everyone? Sociologists, anthropologists, they talk about at least 3 generations, but with a proviso. 3 generations as long as the charismatic leader with all of his characteristics remain supervising these 3 generations. Which means what? In the context of Islam, that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had to be overseeing everything, or someone as close to his character as possible. And we have no one else but Ali. Ghadir was to underscore this particular problem, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, the Holy Prophet knows, that this message, Islam, cannot be preserved without any deviation, tahrif, and so on, unless there is a character that Quran says, وَأَنفُسَنَا وَأَنفُسَكُمْ. And then what do we have? Sheikh Nabil, one of the Wahhabis, says, recite Surah Al-Mubahala, نَدْعُ أَبْنَاءَنَا وَأَبْنَاءَكُمْ وَنِسَاءَنَا وَنِسَاءَكُمْ. When he gets to أَنفُسَنَا وَأَنفُسَكُمْ, forgets about it. Why? Because he knows if he says أَنفُسَنَا وَأَنفُسَكُمْ, somebody's going to ask, say, who were the أَنفُسَنَا وَأَنفُسَكُمْ? He has to talk about Ali. This is why I say it's ideological. Now, leaving these people aside, the society needed. So to understand the significant damage that Saqifa did to Islam, that we are still suffering as a consequence, is because it disrupted this particular strategy, smooth transition of power to someone that could preserve Islam and cared about Islam as much as the Holy Prophet did. Not talking about tribe mentality. You go to, inshallah, tomorrow night when we talk about this, the talk about Saqifa is based on clan logic. Our qabila versus your qabila. It's as if 23 years life of the Holy Prophet went up in smoke. That clearly establishes for us that we really needed a leadership under Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam alayhi that Saqifa totally disrupted. And this is something that our Khilafah, Imam, and everything else is entangled in with all the events that took place. Tomorrow night, inshallah, we will discuss the concept of Saqifa. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And as a consequence, what were the result of it? Now here again, at least some overlap as far as the history exists between understanding from Shia point of view and a Sunni point of view. At the time, 100 years later, 80 years later, we had a group of people that came, reflected on Saqifa, and began to sanitize it and gloss over it and create a narrative justifying it. The leadership, was society needed a leadership? Well, tell me, if crooked old men that had converted to Islam 2 years ago or 4 years ago, They were shrewd enough to understand the society needs a leader. The Holy Prophet didn't. And he grew up in the same tribe mentality. His grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, when he died, before his death, he brought in all his sons and appointed Abu Talib as a successor. And he was present. He was 8 years old. And he saw it. It was nothing foreign to him. Then the concept of getting together in a place and deciding where you have a clear nas from the Holy Quran and command from the Holy Prophet, that becomes violating it. That is serious issue that we really need to discuss. Inshallah, tomorrow night. Thank you very much. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to remain on the right path, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.